Hey there, Writer Rebels. Today we are going to talk about the one thing I have wanted to make a video about ever since I started my YouTube channel. That's right, folks. Today we are going to be talking about Degrassi. Hello everyone, it's me, Scarlett Kol, author of fairy tale fiction, dystopian, and paranormal stories for young adults, YouTuber, and storyteller. And today I'm here to talk about one of my favorite TV franchises of all time, and that is Degrassi. Before we get into it, I do want to let people know that you do not need to be a Degrassi fan to watch this video. I am going to be covering writing tips, so I will make sure that everything is explained very well so you'll be able to understand the point I'm trying to get across without having seen the show or only seeing a few episodes. However, if I'm lucky, maybe I will have made a few new Degrassi fans out there. But before I get started, I do want to thank all of my subscribers for coming back week after week and leaving me some fantastic comments for me to address and to engage with you guys. I love hearing what you guys think of my videos, so make sure you're leaving those in the comments below. If you are brand new here, take a look around. I release videos on Thursdays about writing and publishing, so if you want to hang around, you are totally welcome to do so. The easiest way to do that is to become a subscriber by hitting that subscription bar and the notification bell below this video. Whether you're a subscriber or whether you're not, make sure you're hitting that thumbs up to let YouTube know that this is a video worth watching. It's right around that subscription bar or right below this video if you're looking for it. So Degrassi, what is Degrassi? For the uninitiated, Degrassi is a teen television show that revolves around the students at Degrassi Community School, located in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Although the school is fictional, Toronto obviously is a real place, so we are not dealing with vampires or werewolves or anything like that. This is a straight contemporary teen drama. This show originally started back in 1979, and the last incarnation of it was put on hiatus by Netflix in 2017. I am very hesitant to say canceled because I really think that Degrassi has a place for a lot of teenagers and has been a staple in the Canadian culture for a long, long time. So I would like to see it come back again another time. This has more lives than a phoenix, so I doubt we are going to see the last of Degrassi Community School and its students. The franchise originally started as the Kids of Degrassi Street back in 1979, which turned into Degrassi Junior High and Degrassi High, which ended in the early 90s. In the early 2000s, we pick up again with Degrassi The Next Generation, which features characters from the original stories now as adults, and then moves into the rebranded straight Degrassi, and then into Degrassi Next Class, which found its home on Netflix for the last few seasons until it has been halted in 2017. Hey, this is Editing Scarlett. Just as I finished filming this video, a couple of days later, somebody released a complete overview of the Degrassi series from a viewer perspective. If you want to know more about it, you definitely should check it out. It's a long video, but at least it's timestamped, which is great. If you want to know more about the show and the characters and all that great stuff, I've linked it in the description box below and you can go check out that video. But finish watching this one first. So why do I find Degrassi so appealing? Well, I love the longevity of it. I think that's absolutely great. It's created its own universe, its own world, and it can really bring watchers in at various different points throughout the series. It is basically a combination between after-school special and soap opera for teens, and as a young adult writer and a reader of young adult fiction, I find this absolutely fascinating and is usually really great for research as well. The show also started out a lot of really great Canadian actors. If you are in Canada, you will see them on various different shows throughout the years, but the ones that most people are aware of is Sinead Grimes, who was in the Beverly Hills 90210 reboot, if you were aware of that one. Nina Dobrev, who was on The Vampire Diaries and played Elena and Catherine. And of course, their most famous alumnus, and that is Drake. That's right, started from the bottom, now we hear. And hopefully he wasn't referring to Degrassi as the bottom, because I think it was a pretty good start. Plus, of course, it's a show that means a lot to me, as it was something that I watched on TV after school or on weekends as I was growing up. Even recently, up to a couple of years ago, they had a made-for-TV movie called School's Out that ended the 1990s run that was aired on primetime. It was actually the first time the F word was ever used in primetime on Canadian television. They aired that at a small private screening featuring Caitlin Ryan and Joey Jeremiah. If you knew about them, they were the quintessential power couple in the original Degrassi Junior High and Degrassi High series. And I actually got to do a meet and greet question period with them, which was super exciting. If you've watched the show, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. If you are also a Kevin Smith fan, Kevin Smith, the person who plays Silent Bob, he was also a huge fan of Degrassi and refers to it often in his movies. He was also featured on Degrassi as an actor because he did want to be involved in writing Caitlin and Joey's story. However, because it is a very Canadian show and deals generally with Canadian filmmakers, he was only allowed to collaborate and act as opposed to being a director for the show. All right, so what has watching all of this Degrassi taught me as a writer? And yes, I have watched every single episode of every single season. So I don't know what that says about me, but we're going to ignore that for now. Anyways, there are generally some things that Degrassi did very, very well, in my opinion. There are some things, obviously, that they could definitely work on. There were some cheesy lines. There were some plot lines that I probably wouldn't have gone with myself if I were a writer, but overall there were some really, really great things that they did and that they did for Canadian television. One thing I do want to remind you is that this is a teen show, so to break a lot of this ground in a teen show was quite remarkable for the time. I also do want to mention, because it kind of has that after school special kind of vibe, there are a lot of topics that they do cover. So I want to give kind of a general trigger warning that I will possibly be bringing up some topics that might be triggering for some people. I won't be getting into too many details, but there were a lot of instances of violence or negative things that did happen on the show. So I might reference them as I go through. However, I do make these videos for pretty much all audiences, so I will keep it relatively clean. But I do want to put that warning out in front of everything before I start talking about my tips. All right, so one of the things that Degrassi did so well was their transitions with their characters. To have a show that spans so long, you need to have people invested as much of the way through as humanly possible. So how did they do that? One of the things that they did really well was when they did the transition from the 1990s show to the 2000s show, they carried over original characters from the Degrassi High series into Degrassi The Next Generation. They played adults, teachers. They kept the same principal that was originally at that school to kind of give people that groundwork of what they remember from that original show. Just like a lot of the reboots nowadays of Ninja Turtles and all that kind of stuff are playing on the nostalgia of those people who enjoyed it when they were younger. The other thing that they did to kickstart the series was the main character of the first season and for several seasons was Emma Nelson. Emma Nelson was the daughter of one of the characters who had a teenage pregnancy back in Degrassi High. So we are now seeing that baby all grown up or getting close to it as she moves through her teen years. This was a great way to tie the old audience into the new series. The other thing that they did really well with transitions is bringing in some of their characters and keeping everything fresh, but allowing the audience to still care about them and want to continue with that journey. Obviously, when you're dealing with high school characters, you only have so many years of high school. Some of the classes did extend into university, but generally you're looking at maybe 5 or 6 years longevity per group of students. However, what they would do is they would introduce a little sister or a little brother. They would have snippets of them right at the beginning. You know, simple things like get out of the living room or leave my diary alone or happy to be at the kitchen table with the family. And then as things progressed, they would slowly have smaller subplots. So you would have an episode that would have some really big things that are happening with your main core characters. And then you would have this small little subplot with younger characters, introducing them to their friends and all that sort of stuff. those subplots would get bigger and bigger and bigger as the seasons progressed. So by the time these characters graduated from high school, their little sisters, their little brothers, and their friends had now become the core characters, and you almost didn't even see it happen because you were so invested in the story in little bits and pieces until it became the main story, and now you wanted to follow along with them for the next several years until they graduated, and so on and so forth. Also, when they had the reincarnation of the show from straight Degrassi to Degrassi Next Class on Netflix, they carried those characters through again to make sure that people had that same touch point that they could stick with all the way through the series. A third example on how they transitioned their characters was in one of the seasons where they had issues with a neighboring school called Lakehurst. They had conflicts with them in a specific season, and then the following season, that school burns down, and we have those characters having to be busted and starting to go to Degrassi. This was a way to bring in a lot of characters very quickly, plus that last season had ended with an altercation in which one of the Lakehurst students had stabbed to death one of the Degrassi students, and therefore created an immediate conflict with having all of these Lakehurst students at Degrassi when all of this stuff had happened. So this was a great way to bring in more characters, breathe new life into the series, and create more offshoots of where to go while still tying it back into the story. So what exactly does this teach us about writing? In this case, it teaches us a lot about series writing. So I'm sure you've read authors before where you read a book or a series of theirs and there's offshoots of characters, other series, etc., 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 and you will read anything. You will read prequels, you will read sequels, you will read offshoot stories, all that kind of stuff, because you just want to be in that world with those characters. You never want to leave. However, there's other authors you've probably read who have the same sort of worlds built around their characters, but you just aren't as interested in reading those extra stories. So when you're working with series, there's usually a couple of ways that authors will go. Either they will transition into a new character later on in the series, like the first 3 or 4 books are about one character, and then we offshoot into other characters and continue down the line, or they will create side series or side stories about those other characters. In both cases, the key to this is making people care. A straight, fresh reboot is probably not going to be as effective because those people who have read the original story are not going to be as invested in those characters. But as much as you're having your readers invested, you are also bringing people in at different entry points within the series. Technically, you could start at any incarnation of Degrassi, and if you are doing this well, as an author, you can start at any series within your world that will bring you into the rest of the world and illuminate everything else. So it's really, really important to make sure that if you are planning to continue with side characters in side series or side stories, that you have your audience invested in those characters in the primary story. It doesn't have to be really big and take away from the other story, but little snippets are going to make that series a lot more successful because people are invested in those characters already, even if the story starts in a different place to bring in a new audience. Another thing that they do really, really well is the establishment of their character arcs. The characters change and evolve really, really well from the beginning of their tenure on the show until they are finished. There are a few characters on there that do stay relatively static, but those are usually just side characters. But the main core characters typically will go through a lot before they are allowed to leave Degrassi. And obviously, as writers, it's super important that characters do have a character arc. But the things that I really enjoyed about the Degrassi character arcs are, A, character arcs were not always positive and did not necessarily follow a straight line, even if they had a positive ending. And 2, no matter how much those characters changed, they are still the same character that we were introduced to back in the beginning. For instance, we have a character named Claire Edwards. She was a character within Degrassi Next Generation section. Claire Edwards was one of those characters that was a really good transition character. She was the little sister of Darcy Edwards, who was one of the characters in Degrassi Next Generation as well. However, we start seeing her very early on. She was one of those ones where they peppered her in really early to make those transitions for when Darcy and her friends would graduate from high school. And she started out as a very straight-laced, mousy kind of character who wore her private school uniform to Degrassi, even though she was no longer a private school student, but just kind of had that righteous sort of personality. She stood up for what she believed in, but she was generally very opinionated. She irritated a lot of people, and she was a very unlikable character in some ways. As the seasons develop, she changes in slow, slight ways, almost to the point where you forget what Claire used to be way back when she started. However, when Claire graduates from Degrassi, she is still the same strong, opinionated woman she has always been. However, she has grown and changed and endured a lot of different things. She had cancer for a while. She ended up getting pregnant. She had a miscarriage that she dealt with. She had a boyfriend and dealing with his bipolar symptoms and how that affected their relationship. She lived through various different suicides of students at her school, and all of those things did impact her character arc. But at the end, she was just a better version of herself. In some cases, some of the characters don't get better. Sometimes they get worse, but that obviously negative character arcs are just as effective. For those people who have watched the show, there are plenty of characters that go through a lot of transitions and become characters that we either really like or don't like, but are still the same people that they were at the beginning. For example, Holly J, she comes in as a mean girl from Lakehurst and then has to deal with her parents losing all of their money. She gains a lot of humility, but at the end of her tenure at Degrassi, she is still the same Holly J. She's still that super strong personality. You also have characters like Bianca D'Souza, who originally came on as more of a villain character who grows a lot over her character arc. And it's very, very interesting to see how much those characters change, especially in the summertime, because a lot of Canadian channels will be showing them in reruns. So if you watch some of the reruns and they're not in the same places, you will see characters on one channel at one point in their character arc, and then watch another episode from another season, and they will be a completely different place than they were in the other one. However, you can totally tell who they are and what they stand for, even though they have changed so dramatically, even within just a season or two. So what does this teach us about character arcs? It teaches us that character arcs do change over time and they aren't a one and done situation. I'm sure we've all read books before, or maybe some of us are still writing this way, but you are trying to show a character arc over a book, and then all of a sudden there's just one particular event where the character completely does a 180 and becomes a new person. Well, to me, a character arc is kind of like a lock in the sense that you need to turn the tumblers one at a time until the lock opens. Every single thing that your character endures through your book, your series, your world is going to change them as a character. So if your character doesn't change until 3/4 of the way through the book, and then all of a sudden you have this massive shift, it's going to feel very out of character because they haven't slowly evolved over time. The other thing is, if you were doing something like this and they are a completely different person, it may still feel very out of character because they're not the same person that they were before. Obviously, that's kind of the point. You don't want them to be the same person that they were before, but fundamentally, there are some things about them that will not change throughout a character arc. One of the things that I'm sure a lot of us have heard in terms of dialogue is that you should be able to tell which character is speaking by reading dialogue without a dialogue tag, if dialogue is done well. Sometimes that's a little tricky to do, but generally that's some of the advice that you'll hear out there. So when you read your character at the beginning and you read your character at the end, can you feel that these are the same character, even though that you've seen the growth and change happen throughout the story? Do they still feel like they are written about the same person, just a better, or worse if you're writing negative character arc, person than they were at the beginning? If they are completely and utterly different from the beginning, then you might get into a situation where your characters are going to feel out of character. One of the other things Degrassi did really, really well was writing hooks. Hooks and cliffhangers. They were excellent at doing that. During the Degrassi Next Generation run, they actually did a lot of these shows as two-parters for pretty much most of the early seasons. So they would do a half-an-hour episode of one thing, and then the second part would air later. So they always had these really great hooks at the end of every single show to keep you wanting to watch the next one. They were also really excellent with season cliffhangers. The nice thing about their cliffhangers, though, is they would still resolve the main problems so that you felt like you had resolution on the series, and then present new questions to start out their next season. For example, in one of the particular seasons, they are dealing with a very large storm. It is a really dramatic episode. A lot of people who shouldn't be together get thrown together. Some people who have problems to deal with get thrown together and are forced to work through them, and we don't know who's all survived the storm, all of the stuff that's happening. We do end the season after the storm is over, so we get to see who's made it through, everything's gonna be okay. So we know how everything has kind of ended up, and we get the resolution for that on the story. Then we turn to another character who gets a phone call who happened to be in a car accident due to the storm, and she is told that yes, everything is okay with her test results from the accident that she had gone through, and that her and her baby will be fine. Obviously, at this point, she does not know that she is pregnant, so this is a bit of a bomb for the next season to have to deal with. However, we do have resolution on where things have happened with the storm. So how does this impact our writing? Obviously, this is probably going to be the most useful if you are writing series, because series are going to have ends where there's going to be a hook into the next book. The reason I like the Degrassi endings is because it provides resolution for the characters in the story and ends that main conflict that we are concerned with, but creates something new to push them into the next book. Honestly, they could have ended that particular season the night of the storm, so we don't know how all of those things played out and pushed us into the next season. A lot of television shows do that, where they don't provide the resolution and keep you hanging all summer. The thing that I really enjoy about the Degrassi ones is because they do give you that resolution of where things are ending and you know where your characters are. However, it gives you that little piece that you are still interested in following through into the next season. When you're writing your series, granted, you could have those cutoffs that are really, really abrupt, and sometimes that does work, but you will probably notice a lot more reviews that are saying, hey, I did not like this cliffhanger, or I really didn't appreciate how this book ended. Granted, some reviews need to be taken with a grain of salt, but you are probably less likely to get those sorts of things if you wrap up your main conflict for that book and then move into the next one. The other thing about their hooks, which was really important, is even if you are writing standalones, keeping people moving pages is super, super important. So if you can find ways to do micro hooks within your chapters, that's going to make a huge difference. Just like Degrassi did the part 1 and part 2 of most of their episodes for their early seasons, this created a almost chapter hook to that particular story. So basically there would be a full plot that would happen over 2 episodes, but there would be enough at the end of that first episode to keep you wanting to watch the next week. And then it would present a new story that would kind of loop into the next one and loop into the next one. So this would keep people watching from week to week because they would want to know the resolution of the plots that they were following. As this is an ensemble cast, you have a lot of subplots that they can work with here. So those loops kept people watching week to week. And if you can find a way to create chapter hooks at the end of all of your chapters, or the majority of your chapters, you're going to keep people wanting just one more page, and then hopefully you're going to get hooked into the conflict and meat of this next chapter and not be able to put it down at the end of that one either. The other thing that Degrassi taught me is that all actions have consequences. So when characters would do things on the show, there would be consequences for the majority of them. There's a few that got skated by, I will admit that, over the years. But generally, if something bad happened, there was always a follow-up as to dealing with that particular thing. If people cheated on their boyfriends, those boyfriends found out. If something happened, the police were involved and they would potentially go to court, lose their license. There were suspensions, there were detentions, there were all these sorts of consequences for the characters that actually occurred within the story. How does this apply to our writing? Obviously, when something happens to your character or your character makes a decision to do something, there should be a consequence to their action. There are a lot of books that I've read out there where the main character basically gets to skate by on a lot of different things because they are the main character. There should be consequences to whatever actions they take. And if there are no consequences when there reasonably should be consequences, there should be an explanation as to why. Maybe they do have an in with the police department in your book and they seem to let them get away with breaking the law. A little convenient, but at least there's an explanation as to why your main character isn't being arrested every 5 minutes. If they break their arm, there's going to be a problem later if they need to be using their arm, and there should be, an issue related to the fact that their arm is in a cast. Unless, let's say, they have magical properties where they can heal their arm. That's an explanation as to why there is no consequence. When people do things, good or bad, there's typically a consequence in your life about it. Main characters do not get a get out of jail free card just because they're main characters. And if they do, your story is not going to feel real or believable. This also goes for magic systems. Just because your characters are magical or can do various different things doesn't mean there shouldn't be consequences to the things that they do or a reasonable explanation as to why those consequences don't apply. And one of the last writing tips that I learned from Degrassi is that bad things do happen to good people, and although it may change them, it does not necessarily define them. Okay, so that's a lot to unpack. Basically, we have a lot of characters or a lot of teenagers. Teenagers get into trouble sometimes, and even though we have good, upstanding individual characters, there are a lot of times where they make bad choices or bad things happen to them because sometimes that's just life. And one of the things I liked about that is Degrassi was not afraid to let those things happen. For example, and this one might be a little bit triggering, one of the characters, Paige, was raped at one point in the show. She is shown going through the consequences of that and having to go to court and face up against her rapist. One would assume that, especially in a teen show, that positive things are going to happen as Paige is a relatively main character. And even though this bad thing happened to her, that she is basically going to face up to her rapist and he is going to be put away. That is not what happens. What happens is she faces up to him. She deals with her issues of going into court, having to recount that in front of a new boyfriend as well. And he gets off scot-free with what has happened. There are other things in the plot where she does get to face up to him and have a little bit more of that vindication. But this is not the way you would think it would end for a main character. You would think that she would go through the effort of going to court and going to trial and that she would win. Well, she didn't. And there are tons of examples through the Degrassi stories that sometimes bad things do happen to good characters. The other thing that I really like about that is the writers were really good at showing that these things changed the characters, but did not just define their characters by them. So in this particular instance with the Paige issue, she does go on to face up to her rapist and does get a little bit more of that closure, even though she did not get it in a justice system kind of way. But in particular, when you have characters who make bad choices and knowingly walk into some negative situations, they didn't make that the be-all end-all about those characters. They allowed those characters to make bad choices and still come back from those decisions afterwards. Just because a character cheated on a boyfriend does not make them a horrible person throughout the rest of the show. Just because somebody made a mistake somewhere doesn't mean that they can't learn from it and become a better character somewhere else. It doesn't mean that those actions didn't have consequences, because in most cases they did have to serve a consequence. However, once that consequence was dealt with, they were able to move on as a character and be more to that. So what is that teaching us about writing? It's basically teaching us two things. Number one, do bad things to your characters. There's so many examples you've probably heard of where people are too nice to their main characters. Their main characters are the ones who are going through the struggle in the story. Do not be afraid to have bad things happen. Do not be afraid to let negative things come into their life or not have the result that everyone is expecting to happen. As long as it makes sense, because you don't really want to just throw things in there that don't make sense. Let bad things happen. People will change and grow from negative things happening, and it may help them solve the problem, become a better person, help out with that whole character arc thing I was talking about at the beginning. The other thing on that point is that all characters and all people are not inherently good or bad. Just because you've done bad things doesn't necessarily mean that you are a bad person or will be a bad person for your entire life. And just because you are predominantly good does not necessarily mean you can't do bad things or that bad things can't happen to you. People are multifaceted, as your characters should be multifaceted. When we're setting up our characters, a lot of character sheets you will see or outlines you will see will talk about what your character flaw is or what are your character's weaknesses. It's a simple question that people have to answer in job interviews. That is because all characters have some sort of weakness. All people have some sort of weakness. So by showing your characters as only good or only bad kind of paints them in a very unrealistic light because they are not fully rounded characters. They are just kind of caricatures of what you want them to be, the hero or the villain. Another thing Degrassi does really well is that it's entertaining and very fast paced. So there was half-an-hour episodes, so to get through a main plot as well as a subplot, possibly two in a half-hour episode, was really challenging. So everything that they said and everything that they did had to hit a point and keep moving things forward to keep people interested in what was going on. Obviously, there is a huge fandom for Degrassi still, even though the show has been off the air for the last 3 years, and why I still think it's possibly going to come back. People were entertained by this show. As I said, it was part after-school special, part soap opera. You would think that after-school special thing might feel a little preachy to some people, but no, they did it in such an entertaining way. You were totally fascinated in what was going to happen with these characters, and you wanted to know where the story was going to lead. This is a great thing and something that a lot of authors, including myself, would totally strive for. If you could know that you wrote basically anything and those readers are going to follow you on to book after book after book after book after book for 40 years, I'd take it. Absolutely. And you definitely have some sort of magic there. As writers, the value in this is that you want to entertain your audience. There are some authors, obviously, that are doing stuff that isn't totally for entertainment, but a lot of us out there just want our readers to enjoy what they're reading, get some value out of it, and feel like they haven't wasted their time sitting there reading your book. So pay attention to your pacing, make sure you're trying to entertain your audience, and don't get too bogged down in all of the details because, like Degrassi, sometimes you're going to make mistakes. Sometimes there's plot lines that don't necessarily work the best, but at the end of the day, you can say that you entertained your audience for over 40 years. Yeah. You've done a good job. And one of the final things I will mention about Degrassi is their focus on diversity and representation. No, This middle-aged cis white woman is not going to tell you how to have better representation in your novel. I don't feel that I'm qualified for that, nor am I going to try. And this is also not a place for us to discuss whether or not Degrassi had good representation in all cases, because I know they didn't. However, if you do leave anything like that in the comments, I will delete it, because I am not starting that sort of argument on this channel. If you have your own channel, your own platform, go right ahead, but you're not doing it here. However, the only reason that I am bringing it up is because I would be remiss not to. Degrassi was a trailblazer of a television show in terms of diversity and representation on TV. They were willing to deal with characters and plot lines that a lot of shows on TV, including adult primetime cable shows, were not even willing to touch. And this was a teen show that, you know, you could watch right after school, which I still think is really great. They had plot lines and characters that represented gender identity, differences in sexual identity, issues with different races and racism, mental health struggles, physical health struggles, and a huge gamut of other things that are extremely important to our society and who we are as people. The only reason that I am mentioning is because it was so important to the fabric of the show and one of the things that made it really special. One thing I liked is that they looked at their show with an open lens as to the world not being one way or the other. And they dealt with some of these things in several different ways with different outcomes. So it wasn't as heavy-handed, I felt, as some other shows that I've seen on TV. The one thing that I really liked about how they dealt with some of the main core characters is that their plot lines were not necessarily always just about that representation aspect of that character. Sure, that was usually introduced at some point, but they had other things going on, you know? They were dealing with their exams. They were dealing with relationships. They had other things going on in their lives than just this one token thing that they were known for. And I thought that that was really, really great. And something that, as a writer, I strive to do better. And I know that there's a lot of writers out there that would like to be able to do that stuff better as well. So for me, I thought it was great that they did try their hardest to have diversity and representation in their stories. And as authors, I think that when we are putting stuff out in the public eye, that we definitely have an obligation to our stories and to our characters to try to do the best by them whenever we can. So you can tell there are several different reasons why Degrassi was so entertaining and why it defines generations of Canadian teenagers as well as other teenagers from around the world, and why people still find it entertaining to this day. It is a great show, and if I have my way, it'll be influencing generations for years and years to come. All right, so hopefully I have made a Degrassi fan out of you. And if I have, make sure you're leaving that in the comments. And if you already are a Degrassi fan, let me know who your favorite character was, or maybe favorite plotline that occurred over its entire 40-year run. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoy videos like this, I do have a few others on my channel, writing tips from boy bands and writing tips from hockey that I have done before that you can definitely check out. However, if you're bored, you can always pick up Degrassi. I believe it is still on Netflix if you are checking it out, or some of the other streaming systems out there. Thank you so much for watching, and if you do want to be a subscriber, make sure you're hitting that subscription bar and the notification bell below this video, and if you liked it, make sure you're hitting a thumbs up to let YouTube know this is something worth watching. Thank you so much for watching today, and I will see you all later.